Hi, I'm Kevin Rusnak, the Chief Historian for the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, headquartered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. This is the latest edition of our Out of the Hangar video series, where we look back at historic moments related to the mission of our organization. This episode looks at the 100th anniversary of the International Air Races held in Dayton, Ohio, and in fact, right here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base from October 2nd through 4th, 1924. Well, to begin our story, we have to look back at the origins of air racing. In the early days of aviation, since the Wright brothers and other competitors were first flying and trying to sell airplanes to build up their activity, air races provided three really critical advantages for them. On the one hand, there was prize money involved that local promoters would offer up hundreds or thousands of dollars to people who could win an air race or demonstrate the best capabilities, fly the longest, and so forth. And so these companies that could fly their airplanes were able to take that prize money and reinvest in them to make better airplanes. And that provided that impetus to make better technology. Secondly, it provided publicity for the activity in general. More and more people around the world got to see airplanes because when there were only a handful of aircraft flying, the only way to see them was if one of these air races or these kind of aerial carnivals came to town, and then you could actually even pay money to go fly in one for the first time. And finally, the air races provided critical experience both to the pilots for flying them, but also to the designers in terms of how could they improve their airplanes, what were the shortcomings, and so forth. Well, once you got to World War I and the aviation exploded around the world, became really a much larger activity, especially for the militaries, we became involved in air racing as this kind of technology proving ground. How could we demonstrate that we had the fastest airplanes or test out new technologies? Well, air races that were pushing the very limits of these envelopes, that was a great way for us to do that. So we were very important competitors in that sport. And by we, I mean the Army Air Service and also the Navy and then other militaries around the world. And they also provided a good venue for us to compare ourselves against international competitors who had the fastest airplanes. Was it us or was it the Europeans? And so there was always a push and pull there that drove aviation technology across the board. Well, by 1924, the pinnacle of this sport was the international air races. And these theoretically brought in competitors from all around the world that would demonstrate the fastest speeds and all the best and latest, newest aircraft to come out. Well, in 1924, those ended up in Dayton. Well, the question is, well, why Dayton? I mean, back then it might have been more obvious than it was to us now because, of course, the Wright brothers were from Dayton, and that's where aviation was in fact born. But for this particular event, we go back not to the Wright brothers, but to the gentleman in the very middle of this picture holding his hat. That's Frederick Patterson. He was the chief executive officer for the National Cash Register Corporation, one of the biggest companies in the country, if not the world, making all the cash registers that all the stores use across the globe. Well, he was also happened to be president of the National Aeronautic Association. That was the organization responsible for running the international air races. So as president, he lobbied for his hometown to host the races for 1924. And just like the Olympics, these cycled between a different city every year. And of course, the organization agreed to this. So in late 1923, Dayton was awarded the 1924 air races, and they scheduled them for that October, as I mentioned. And in this picture, you can see two other important gentlemen. On the far left here, you have Major Augustine Warner Robins. He was head of our predecessor, Wilbur Wright Field, that was here in Dayton. And then on the other side, the gentleman holding his cane in his hand, that's Major General Mason Patrick. He was head of the Army Air Service, the equivalent of the Air Force Chief of Staff today. So where were we going to hold these air races? Well, if you look at the area circled in yellow on this map, that's Wilbur Wright Field. That was our first military aviation facility established in Dayton. That was stood up in 1917 in the summer to do training and logistics for the Air Service. And it was still operating now, mostly as a flying field, but then also for that supply depot that was in part of the field there. And they had a great flying area there. They had lots of room. So it was a perfect spot to hold air races. And then if you look off to the other side of the map, circled in red is McCook Field. That was predecessor to the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center. Its engineering division there was doing the acquisition and research and development missions that we're still doing here at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base today. Now, they weren't holding any air race events there, but the engineering division there was responsible for the technology development I mentioned, as well as preparing the airplanes and things like that for the races. Here's an aerial shot of Wilbur Wright Field. The line of buildings here, kind of in the center left, those were the hangars, and up in the upper left-hand corner was the flying area. And that's about where the runway for Wright-Patt is today. This is what we now call Area A of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Here's kind of a close-up of those hangars seen from the other area. So this is what it would have looked like right around 1923, 1924. You can see some of these airplanes in the foreground. And then this finally, we've got a picture of McCook Field, our predecessor, as I mentioned, with a line of trucks here that are setting off on a publicity parade to gin up interest in the air races. So fast forward to the fall of 1924, about a month before the air races were going to begin on September 2nd, 1924. This young man here, Lieutenant Alex Pearson, he was a McCook Field test pilot. He was going to be racing in the fastest race during the air races. Well, he and his fellow pilots were practicing over Wilbur Wright Field. He was in this Curtiss R8 Racer. Well, unfortunately for him, as he was nearing maximum speed during one of these practice runs, his wings actually shook apart on part of his airplane, plunging him into the ground and killing him in front of a few hundred people, including his wife. While tragic, these sorts of accidents were not uncommon for air racing in that day, or indeed for aviation in general. But as they say, the show must go on. So the races went on as scheduled exactly a month later after his crash. Well, here was the schedule for October 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, exactly 100 years ago as I'm recording this on October 3rd. You can see there were 12 different events that involved civilian pilots, military pilots, small airplanes, large airplanes, fast airplanes, slow airplanes, even model airplanes for kids had their own event. And that was in addition to all these sorts of demonstration activities, the aerial circus things that they called it. And here's a good map of the course here that shows you as they would fly kind of counterclockwise over these courses. The shortest one was 5 miles. The longest one was this 50-kilometer course there, and they would fly a certain number of laps to meet those. And you can see kind of out here at the bottom, that was the starting and finish line. And that's what I'm going to show you in this picture. That white building there, that was the timer stand. That's where the official judges stood. And off to the left, that's black and white striped tower. That was about a 50-foot tall pylon. That was the official starting line. So if you had what they called a flying start, meaning that you would take off, and then as soon as you crossed that line, that officially began your race. That's what Pearson was doing when he crashed, was diving towards that at maximum speed. Here's a good shot of the crowd. The newspapers reported they built about a mile-long grandstand because they were expecting so many people to come visit. And in fact, on the final day, they estimated they had about 50,000 spectators to watch the races. Some of the other displays they had here, this was from McCook Field. They had a free-flying balloon. On the left here, you had an airship, and then below that are some of the Army's bombers. Some of the more unique aircraft were in the light or efficient aircraft category. This one was nicknamed the Flying Bathtub, and actually built by an engineer at McCook Field. This was showing how efficient small airplanes could be. Here's an example of it flying over this kind of mock-up skyline of New York City that they built just for this event. And that was used on the last day for bombing demonstration to show how accurate bombers could be. One thing you'll note is there's no Empire State Building or Chrysler Building yet. Those aren't built for a few more years, until the end of the 1920s, in fact. And the reason I'm showing this picture is because this actual event was happening exactly 100 years ago to the hour of when I'm recording this. So if one of my predecessors was sitting here, that's what he'd be seeing flying over his head 100 years ago today. Okay, the final event, the premier one, was called the Pulitzer Race. Now, this was the one that would set a world speed record typically. This was for the fastest airplanes. For this year, there were only 4 planes, and they were all for the Army Air Service. Pearson was not in it anymore, obviously, because he died, but he had a substitute. And all these planes that were flying had already been used to great success in other air races, and they were all Army pilots. And this is the official scorecard that was filled out by one of these McCook Field employees who was actually watching the race. You'll notice the top line here for Captain Bert Skeel is blank. Well, this is Captain Bert Skeel right here. He was an operational, essentially a fighter pilot from a unit brought in to fly this as a substitute for Pearson. He was flying this Curtiss R6 racer that we had actually purchased this from the Navy for the grand total of $1 just to do this race. Well, just like Pearson, he had taken off and was diving towards the starting line. He was back towards that upper part of the field, kind of near where there's a river and some trees, when nearly the same thing happened to him as happened to Pearson. The wing broke off of his airplane and he plunged to the ground at high speed, throwing up a huge column of dirt, and unfortunately perished in front of those 50,000 people, which included his wife. The other competitors didn't know, they couldn't see that he had crashed, so they finished the race, but that was essentially the end of the activities, and they canceled the rest of the festivities for the day after he died. Well, so despite those tragic accidents, the air races were considered a great success. And Major General Mason Patrick, the head of the Air Service, he has a quote that I want to share with you. He said, "The Army Air Service is especially pleased with the achievements of the commercial flyers. The building up of a commercial industry will be a strong factor in defense of the country and will also increase business facilities. These races afford an opportunity for the whole country to see just what is being accomplished in aeronautics." And I think that's our big takeaway for today, is that aviation development is a joint activity. It's a partnership between the military and commercial industry to push that envelope to create better airplanes that both contribute to national defense and to a better civilian aviation industry. Well, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and be sure to check out our website for more information on the air races. Thanks again.